All right, let's get this show on the road. Okay, number one, you've got one advantage. I'm an attention whore, so I make a lot of videos. Number two, I love the Avro Arrow, so why not make a video of the Avro Arrow? Why not? And plus, somebody asked me, dude, can you make a video of the Avro Arrow? Although I've done a couple of them, you never have to twist my rubber arm to talk about this airplane. I'm one of those very few people that ever had the opportunity to actually sit in the Avro Arrow cockpit. Arrow 206 that was sitting at the National Aviation Museum. The nose of the airplane's there, the part of the wing, landing gear. There was also some models, and of course there was one of the nice, big, huge Iroquois engines sitting there. And or was it a Renda engine? I can't remember which. Anyway, one of the coolest things about this airplane when you get into it, okay, is it really did feel like a Buck Rogers airplane. When you close the clamshell type of cockpit doors, you really couldn't see very well forward. I can tell you that from firsthand experience. But it was kind of neat. It would have done its role as an interceptor. Now, from the videos that I have made on the Arrow in the past, comments go all over the board. It's the best plane that was ever designed in history. The thing was a piece of junk and it was over budget. There was a lot, everybody has something to say about the Arrow. I try to look at it as realistically as possible, and I think I do a pretty decent job of knowing what I'm looking at. There's a lot of things that the Arrow isn't, and there's a lot of things that it was that, we lost. What the bigger side of what we lost was the number one, innovative people that worked on it. Number two was that kind of future of independence towards, our own kind of Air Force designed airplanes. I mean, the Russians designed their own airplanes. The Americans designed their own airplanes. The French and the British designed their own airplanes. People, have all these airplanes that the Chinese design their own airplanes, all kinds of stuff like that. With the innovation of Canadians, particularly in the 1950s, there was no reason why we shouldn't have. Now, yes, Avro Canada was a British-owned company, but what people don't understand is that the Avro Arrow was a complete Canadian undertaking. There was no British involvement. It was basically the British said, okay, well, we'll let them build their airplane in their own country. Why not? Even though technically the company was a British company, but it wasn't a British airplane. It was a Canadian airplane. And the uniqueness of it, it's probably one of very few airplanes that went instantly into production. There was no prototype with the Arrow. The Arrow was basically designed to replace the CF-100, but to cut costs, what they did, they said, we'll design it so perfectly that we won't have to have a prototype. It'll just go right into service, which was in itself a hugely risky move. I don't know of any other company in history that has ever done that, but we did. Now, the first maiden flight had pretty much zero malfunctions. The only thing, I think there was one little pot lamp that didn't light up, or a switch that didn't light up. That was the only recorded malfunction on that flight. I think total hours flown was something like 68 or 168 hours. It's been a while since I looked at all that stuff, so if I'm wrong, please forgive me. I know there's some purists out there that will, you bastard, how did you get that wrong? This is the nose that I sat in. Both forward and aft cockpit are still part of that airplane. This is a life-size replica that they made. Oh, whoops, that's from the Ottawa Aviation Museum. Some of those old, the Lank and stuff like that. I spent a lot of my lunch hours in those. Those pictures ended up getting into the Avro thing. But hey, you know what? A MiG-15, that's possible that, the Arrow could have been intercepting MiG-15s, but it was primarily designed for a couple of roles. Number one, it was a patrol airplane, interceptor. The idea was NORAD would detect in any weather whatsoever, if they detected Tu-95, the Tupolev Bears, or the Badger, I forget what is it the 144 Badger? Anyway, and the Bison, these Soviet bombers, which the Bison didn't live up to its potential, but it was jet powered and a little faster than the Bear, and this put it just slightly out of the range envelope of the CF-100, and the CF-100 it could make it to the altitude. Like the CF-100 was a good airplane. It served till 1986 with the Canadian RCAF. But the thing is that it wasn't quite fast enough to catch the newer Soviet bombers at altitude. It could make it to the altitude, but the fighter was as fast as their bomber, so it means you couldn't gain on them. So we needed a new interceptor. Hence, the idea for the Arrow came along, and there were several different variants that they thought about basically making a delta wing version of the Starfighter, the CF-104 Starfighter, but it was too small. It lacked in range. It would have been a hell of a dogfighter, I'm sure, but we needed something with more range, something bigger, and something that could get there fast. Well, that was the Arrow. So when they finally decided on it would be a delta winged airplane, they had to decide how much wing area it would have. Would it have 1,000 square feet, 1,200 square feet, or 1,400 square feet? Now, the 1,400 square foot, that thing would have been, the Arrow was big enough as it is. It was 85 feet long. So with a 1,400 square feet, that was a lot of wing area. But they figured the drag factor, they would have lost a bit in speed. So they settled in the compromise to give up a little bit of maneuverability with the 1,000 square foot wingspan or wing area. They went with the 1,200, which was the best of both worlds. Give them a good, stable platform, great interceptor, good at high altitude. The thing rolled at about 150 degrees a second, so that was pretty much World War II type Spitfire kind of maneuverability. 15 degrees of pitch and yaw, from what I understand. The thing would have probably maneuvered very similarly to the F4 Phantom. I believe it would have done pretty good that way. Where I think it would have done better than the F4 Phantom is at high altitudes. Number one, the Arrow had a lot more wing area. The idea of the 1,200 square foot wing area, the only combat aircraft that I know of, or frontline fighter interceptor now that has that much wing area currently would be the Su-27, Su-35 line. The big airplanes. CF-100 or CF-18, I think, has something like 660 square feet of wing. Don't quote me on the number, but it's in that ballpark. Most of the American airplanes have less wing area, but they tend to have higher roll rates, where a lot of the Soviet aircraft tend to have lower roll rates, but more wing area, which gives them better range, such as the Su-27 and stuff like that. Now, the MiG-29 is a small airplane and has, it's very comparable to the CF-18 or the FA-18 in wing area, but the MiG-29 is a bit of a lift body kind of effect to it. So in that case, it does benefit the MiG-29 in the climb rate. With the sharper sweep of the wing, it does better up high. The CF-18 tends to do better, down low and in the mid-range, that type of thing. So, it's kind of a compromise. There's always going to be a compromise somewhere. But the other thing about the CF-100 is that it had a 16-foot bomb bay, which is huge. Now, one thing a lot of people don't like to talk about the Avro Arrow is, not only was it an interceptor to shoot down bombers, which had it completed its full testing phase and firing missiles and everything, the idea was to be able to shoot down 8 bombers. You could basically lock onto 8 bombers at once and shoot them all down, and you could track up to 12 bombers at a time. The other thing was that it was supposed to do a really nasty job that nobody likes to talk about. But the CF-104 Starfighter was to do it. The CF-101 Voodoo was to do it. And probably even to today, the CF-18 is probably at some point would be doing this. Basically, we never here in Canada, although we could produce our own nukes if we wanted to, we're a very uranium-rich country. And we also have all the capabilities of enriching uranium to any grade we want. But we chose way back in the 1950s to not become a nuclear power by choice, not because we, just it's not Canadian enough. It's not polite Canadian enough to be doing that. That said, it didn't mean we didn't have a whole arsenal of American bombs that we would strap onto the bottom of the Arrow and basically fire, either guided or unguided nukes into bomber streams, whatever, or even do strikes. So the Arrow would eventually have become probably a strike aircraft, or even possibly a light bomber. But it never got that far, so we'll never know. The missile that was supposed to be used in the Arrow was going to be a Canadian designed. Again, they got a little bit too ambitious for the program. the thing is there was a lot of mismanagement with the Arrow program. Plus, there was also, the worry of spies in the Arrow plant. Russian spies in there. I mean, heck, we've recently caught Chinese spies in our shipbuilding program. So, I mean, spies is something that's nothing new there. And in a politically correct society, you're going to get a lot of spies on your technology. But the thing is that they wanted to build this missile called the Velvet Glove, and the program was canceled before anything could really get off the ground. But they did do some testing on this Velvet Glove missile. It never got to see the full program. So the Arrow is going to have these, not only its own engines, 100% Canadian designed airplane, and it was also going to have its own weapon system. Now, the way the radars used to work in those days is a little different from the way they work now. Back in the day, the idea of shooting a aircraft down with a missile was a really difficult task. Number one, airplanes usually didn't hold still. And number two, the reliability and tracking of a missile had to be radio guided for the most part to the target. And that usually would require ground control to help you to do this. The CF-100 basically had this very simple little radar. And what you did is when you were on target, locked onto your target, whether you were firing rockets or you were firing missiles, there would be like a little kind of almost really basic radar, which would create flash an X pattern when you were in firing position. So if you were too far, or too close, you couldn't fire accurately on it. But if you had a bullseye, the radar would show an X on it, and then you could fire, and you would probably hit your bomber or whatever. Well, the thing is you still needed the ground control from the CF-100. You still needed the ground control to be able to guide yourself to the target. So even though you had radar, it was very limited, maybe 8 kilometers at the most. Now, the Arrow didn't have a tremendous, powerful radar, to today's standard, but it didn't require ground radar to help it to fire the missiles. It could do it all. It would have been able to do it all by itself. Now, that said, the other thing about the Arrow was it could cruise fast, given the shape of it. And technically, you could argue that the Arrow is a lift body as well. Very stable airplane to fly. In fact, it flew so smoothly that on a few landings, the airplane touched down so lightly it wouldn't even set off the runway sensors. It came down so smoothly. It was, it's a big kite, right? So one of the, there were those things. The only real problems I think they faced in the Arrow was, they did have a collapse of Arrow 202. I think collapsed the landing gear on one landing, and they had, I think, another problem a few times with the nose landing gear door. But other than that, they really didn't have a lot of problems with this airplane, so to speak. Again, they didn't rack up a lot of time, considering the length of the program and everything like that. They never really got to see what the airplane could do. But one thing they were talking about in the past couple of years was resurrecting a modern version of the Arrow. And I think even still to this day, the airplane itself, if you didn't have to try to reinvent the wheel and try to turn it into something that it's not, and you just took the basic airframe design, built it out of modern day composites, and built it with the same stable airframe, so you didn't have to rely on fly-by-wire that, like the F-35, that is so complicated that the airplane, it's almost impossible to keep the thing flying. One thing that worked for the Arrow was, particularly to today's standards, it's a simple airplane. It's very, very simple. There's really nothing to it. 39,000 parts, sure, but there's really nothing to it. The design is incredibly simple. Sorry, getting a little dry here. And you can capitalize on that because you can build an this aeronautic design and avionics mentality that a stable airplane cannot be maneuverable. A stable airframe cannot achieve super maneuverability. Well, that is completely false. And I'll just say one airplane, MiG-29. Stable airframe. Maybe not, the newer ones are all fly-by-wire now, but the initial, MiG-29 is a stable airframe. The Su-27 is not. But yet, with a stable airframe, look at the maneuverability of the MiG-29. It's almost unmatchable. It's a very impressive airplane. So this idea that you can't get that kind of maneuverability with a stable airframe, I think, is just aircraft designers that want to make a lot of money on make work projects such as the F-35. Now, I'm not trashing the F-35 as an airplane. I'm trashing it as a program that seems to be just a make work airplane. Because if the F-35 works as advertised, it's going to be an incredible airplane. And yeah, it is kind of an incredible airplane and impressive to watch fly when it works. But right now, for example, the F-35 has a problem with its Gatling gun because the computer program it doesn't work right and it doesn't fire properly. It doesn't guide. Number one, why do you need a computer program to fire a cannon? And I get the idea where they want to over automate things and make things so simplistic that I do understand modern day cannons on fighter aircraft, whether it's a 30 millimeter or 20 millimeter or whatever, or 27 or 25 millimeter, it doesn't really matter. Yes, a lot of them do have a guidance, to help keep a lock on its target and track. But even at that, there's only a limited amount of tracking. So yeah, it might give you a little bit of an extra advantage to have this. But when you add up the cost of maintenance, the program, maybe just training a better pilot, for what you're going to save in the maintenance, you could spend in the fuel and just get the pilot to be better with the main gun. And with something the size of an Arrow, you could put the same way the CF-18 or an A-10 has the cannon right in front of the pilot's face, so to speak. Well, you could do the same thing with the Arrow. You could put a 25 millimeter cannon in there. It's a big airplane. Put a big gun on it. 30 millimeter, 25 is good enough. 25 millimeter cannon with 1,000 rounds. Those AMX rounds, the ones that shoot out of the lab. Name me an airplane that could withstand a hit from that thing out to a kilometer. Nothing. It would just blast apart bombers like crazy. So the Arrow itself, I think the design still has potential. And why it would work for Canada is because it's big. There's no equipment modern day that goes on the CF-18 that you couldn't fit inside the Arrow. And in fact, you could take an advantage. Again, why reinvent the wheel? When we look at Russian fighter aircrafts, they don't reinvent the wheel. They just refine it. They build an Su-27, then the Su-27 turns into, say, an advanced Su-30 or Su-34 kind of spin-off program. You want a Navy variant, you make the Su-33. You want a super variant, you make the Su-35 or Su-37, which is really the Su-35. And then from there, you want to go into the future, you go with the T-50. And that's what the Soviets have done. Well, we could do the same thing. We wouldn't, if we were to build a new Arrow, obviously we wouldn't build it identical to the old one. But there's a lot of things that we could keep the same. The biggest one would be visibility, because visibility, this airplane would work as a bomber, it would work as a strike aircraft or a high altitude reconnaissance. In a dogfight, it would not, you wouldn't, because a MiG-21 has bad visibility, rearward wise. I've jumped into, quite a few jet cockpits, and there's some that have good visibility, a lot that don't. The F-5, for example, the Freedom Fighter, it has okay visibility, but once you start looking past your shoulder, it's like sitting on the back of a city bus. You just can't see what's behind you. And in a dogfight, that's not good. That was one of the problems that plagued the MiG-21. One of the problems that plagued the Thunder Chief. That was a problem that plagued the F-4 Phantom as well. And a lot of other Soviet aircraft too, like the MiG-23, the MiG-22, or the Su-22, sorry. Again, once you got behind these aircraft, nobody knew where you were. The MiG-25, the MiG-31, again, these airplanes, no rearward visibility. And then you get something like try to dogfight with something like an F-16. The airplane doesn't have to be, the F-16 doesn't have to be that much better. It's the visibility, because you can be 95% out of the cockpit when you're shooting down enemy airplanes. You just, for that last few seconds, you might either use a HUD or whatever. But also, too, in this day and age, the thing to keep in mind is the old day of getting the enemy fighter aircraft into the HUD display of your aircraft is no longer needed, really, because of look-down, shoot-down systems. The CF-18 has it. CF-18 has excellent visibility. I mean, you could see the back of your own head in one of those things. It's just, yes, I have sat in the cockpits, the one that was at the museum. I got to jump in it and stuff, and of course, going to air shows and stuff like that, you jump into the cockpits of those, and of course, you see, amazing visibility. One of the airplanes that I always thought had the best visibility was the F-86 Sabre. That thing, I've been in the P-80, which we call the CL-30 here, Shooting Star, It had good visibility. The Havilland Vampire, Canada's first fighter jet that we had, it had really good visibility. It was, a big bubble. In fact, it had, you almost felt like you were sitting in a jet-powered cloth-wing biplane. It's kind of an interesting airplane. I'm going to do a video on the Vampire because I think it was one of my favorite early jets. Just kind of a really cool boom-tailed airplane. But visibility is the big one. So you could fix the visibility problems on the Arrow with modern technology using the same kind of concept. I would always keep it a two-seater, just for the idea that you could use it as a trainer. You could use it, have a weapons officer in the back, or electronic warfare, whatever. I mean, again, you could have interchangeable noses on this. Today it's a electronic warfare aircraft. Tomorrow it's a reconnaissance. The day after it's just your average everyday fighter. You can do it for all kinds of stuff. The idea that you have an internal bomb bay, really makes the airplane a clean, slippery, aerodynamic. Gives you lots of advantages definitely in range. One thing about the Arrow in ferry range, it probably had about a 2,000 mile range. You hear different, quotes across the board. In intercept mode, kind of like time to climb type thing, you had about a 300-mile range. Again, we're talking a lot of power in a very short amount of time to get to 50,000 feet. But even in 1959, this thing was making it to 70,000 feet. That's even impressive by today's standards. And with a full combat load, could climb 5 miles a minute. Now, yes, the F-4 Phantom could climb at 8 miles a minute, and the modern-day Su-27 can climb at 10 miles per minute. But 5 miles per minute in 1959 to 70,000 feet, that's impressive. That's impressive. And that wasn't the full capability of the airplane. We never got to the full capability of the airplane. We replaced the Arrow with the CF-101 Voodoo, and the cost that it cost us to replace the CF-101s with the CF-101s would have actually completed the Arrow program, but they said no. They decided no, we're not going to do that, which is too bad. But there's a lot of things. Politics killed the Arrow, like anything. The espionage, they were worried about the Russians getting our technology, which, tell you the truth, yes, the Arrow was super innovative, but I don't think it's something that other people wouldn't have came up with. I mean, we already knew how to break the sound barrier before we built the airplane. I mean, Chuck Yeager already paved that road. Getting to Mach 2 wasn't impossible. There were airplanes that could do Mach 2, but the thing about the Arrow where it was impressive is the fact that the capabilities of the design were not fully realized. I'm sure the airplane would not have been able, in its original, like Arrow 201, would not be able to supercruise. It would melt. I mean, a lot of airplanes could go supersonic in those days, but the problem was that the heat buildup, would end up melting the aircraft. In fact, the big maple leaf roundels on the wings, in one flight after the airplane went supersonic, the roundels actually started, melting and slipping back on the wing. That wing is still at the Ottawa Aviation Museum. You can see it actually moved back about an inch. It just kind of slipped on the. So that tells you how hot the airplane will get going above the sound barrier. So obviously, at some point, the Arrow would have had to have been made out of better materials. Now, there was never a titanium variant or what you call it, the stainless variant. For example, the MiG-31 has stainless and other kind of composites in it, probably cobalt and all kinds of stuff like that to take the heat. Titanium, can take a lot of heat, but again, depending on how it's built, the Arrow was mainly built out of aluminium, so there was probably a fair amount of titanium on it, but like anything, it was still, a new airplane. But the idea, with 31,000 pound thrust behind it, this airplane probably would have supercruised quite easily. Again, being so aerodynamic. The other thing is that it also had the ability to, if you would have put air-to-air refuel on it, but you have the ability with just the internal fuel to patrol, and that's something Canada needs. I mean, the CF-18 basically without drop tanks is a 600-mile range. So you got to basically fly a tanker, carry drop tanks. With drop tanks you might get a 1,200-mile range, but even at that, once you start putting on drop tanks, you're no longer carrying weapons. So the CF-18, a great airplane, don't get me wrong, it's not big enough. The Arrow, well, you got a 2,000-mile range, you might not need to use the tanker for air-to-air refueling. pull the throttle back to 200 miles an hour and cruise for 10 hours. You know what I mean? That's, call it a day, you know. Maybe you want a super cruise. One of the things they said that where the Arrow had potential over the F-35 is that on a single, you know, the same amount of time flying, the Arrow would be halfway to Toronto, where the the F-35 would be, you know, again 600 miles out, it would be out of fuel. And payload, well, you could carry, you know, at the time in the internal bomb bay on the Arrow, you could carry about 4,000 pounds, or that of a B-25 Mitchell. Again, I'm sure it was probably capable of carrying more, but like it, you know, like anything, it never got the chance to prove it. So with that, cruising at 600 miles an hour, which is faster, you know, above 600 miles an hour, which it was capable of cruising at around those speeds, you would be basically cruising faster than the F-35 and covering more distance in a shorter amount of time, you know, with the same amount of fuel. You know, so longer range, you know, in shorter time, more fuel, or with less fuel. So you have that advantage. And then, of course, you know, the top speed advantage. Just the original variant of Arrow had a possibility of Mach 2.5 in the airframe. Which is the speed of most super fighters now. I think the Su-27 lineups, the Su-35, Mach 2.3 is usually as fast as, but most aircrafts are not going to really need to go that fast anyway, and here's why. After 400 miles an hour, it really gets hard to turn an airplane without the pilot turning himself into mush. And although, you know, I think the biggest record was a Russian pilot who took 18 Gs in a simulator, like a jet kind of experiment that they did, most people would be dead, you know. So one or two guys might survive it, but the rest of them, you know, after 9 Gs, I mean, you could rip your head off doing that, you know. So that type of thing is, you're going to really have to have an airplane that has enough wing area to do low speed handling. And this is what you see with these super fighters, where the early 50s, like the F-86 Sabre was basically a dogfighting airplane, and still had that kind of seat of the pants, razzle dazzle kind of flying against the MiG-15 and the MiG-17s later on. Then you see the kind of go fast, straight line kind of airplanes like the CF-104 Starfighter, the F-4 Phantom, the MiG-21, the MiG-23. These airplanes didn't maneuver quite as much, but they were high speed. They, you know, but because of their high speeds, you had to be careful, A, not to melt the airplane if you're going too fast, and B, not to pull a wing off if you turn too hard. And of course, obviously, the pilot would have to stay conscious while all this was going on. So you need an airplane that can do low speed handling. And when you watch an air show, the most impressive stuff you see the pilots do usually isn't the high speed one pass haul ass kind of stuff. It's usually that low speed, like for example, I was watching a Canadian pilot fly at 120 miles an hour in a high alpha, you know, going, you know, 5 feet above the runway type of thing, or maybe 10 feet above the runway, with a, you know, that's impressive. You know, that's impressive to have that much control over the airplane before it stalls, when an airplane of that magnitude usually will fall out of the sky at 160 miles an hour. So obviously the wing area of the Arrow will play into factor of an advantage at lower speeds, if you can get the aircraft weight down. Now, there's a few different weights that the Arrow was at: 39,000 pounds, 43,000 pounds, which again puts it in that kind of you know, F4 Phantom kind of territory. Now, how would this have fared against the F4 Phantom? I don't know. The F4 Phantom had a lot of advantages, but I think at high altitude, I would put my money on the Arrow because it had its full engine capabilities. Where the Phantom did really well is the fact that it was very powerful. You know, you could climb really fast, 8 miles a minute, even to today's standards. It is a hell of a feat. And I've seen F4 Phantoms fly. I've been in an F4 Phantom, not flying, but at air shows and stuff. The Germans, they fly here in Canada from time to time in our. They use our airspace. I guess we have a deal, you know, a lot of deals worked out with Germany. Sometimes it's hard to tell the German military from the Canadian military because we use, you know, a lot of similar equipment. But one of the things they used to have at Laval all the time was some F4 Phantoms, and they'd buzz my house every now and then. And you know, see the, you know, the German F4 Phantoms, and you know, you watch these guys maneuver these things. They had about 400 of them at one point because there was over 5,000 Phantoms made. And when you watch an F4 Phantom turn, it's kind of a weird way it turns. You know, it doesn't turn that well. Because of the small wing area, but once you put it into afterburn, the thing kind of like slingshots over. It turns really well with the in full burn. The CF-101 Voodoo was kind of the same thing. It was kind of more of a go fast airplane. It did turn that well. Definitely would not turn with a MiG-29. And the problem with the Phantom is they were so afraid in Vietnam that the pilots would basically crash the airplanes in a dogfight that they actually made they said the pilots weren't allowed to dogfight, and they also had this concept that it was such an advanced airplane that nobody would ever get close enough. You could shoot all your enemies down beyond visual range, and they would there was no need to learn how to dogfight. And we still hear that same rhetoric today with the F-35 and the F-22, that because these airplanes are so advanced that no enemy fighter will ever get close to it. But then what happens when there's just this little technical problem that they have when the enemy forces turn their transponders off. And then it's like, are they good guys or are they bad guys? Let's fly up closer and see what happens to see who they are. Oh, wait a minute, they're bad guys and now we're perched. Oh, guess what? You now have a dogfight. And this is what happened to the F-4 Phantom pilots. So when they'd go, out on routine and say rendezvous at 20,000, and they started, actually, learning how to dogfight again, and after that the losses went down, and when they put a gun back on the F-4 Phantom, the losses dropped even more, because these little kind of $4 million MiG-21s were shooting down these $40 million F-4 Phantoms, and they couldn't figure out why. Well, the MiG-21's definitely no advantage other than in maneuverability. I mean, you're talking 14 degrees a second on the F-4 Phantom, where 19 degrees of pitch on the MiG-21. About the same visibility. However, you get in close, that high roll rate, a small wing area, and light turning capabilities of the MiG-21. If you try to follow this guy in your F-4 Phantom, what tended to happen is eventually the MiG-21 would get, basically being able to turn slightly faster, would come around on you, and next thing you know, he's behind you. Now, with the Arrow, bringing the Arrow back into this, where it would have the advantage again is the bigger wing area, it could go up higher, hold a tighter turn at about 15 degrees, but the thing is it could do it higher without stalling out, and it could do it at slightly higher speeds without stalling out. The biggest disadvantage to the MiG-21 was it only had like 300 square feet of wing, and like the Starfighter. So it made it very, very agile, but it also, at certain speeds, if you tried to roll more than 90 degrees a second, you would actually go into a flat spin. It was just, there wasn't enough wing area to keep this thing going straight. And that was some of the problems that the Soviet pilots had. And if you look at combat footage from like the Vietnam area, whenever you see a turning fight between an F-4 Phantom and a MiG-21, it's literally a turning fight. It's not a reverse roll and hammerhead, and it's not like a World War I or a World War II fight where they're just all over the sky. It's literally let's just get into this turn and see who ends up behind who. And then what the Phantom pilots used to always do was use their power to get away, where they knew they couldn't outturn the MiG, but as soon as they'd go below 2,000 feet and hit the afterburner and go vertical, well, at 8 miles a minute, they would lose they'd lose a lot of fuel, number one, but they'd be up nice and high, and they would lose the MiG-21, and then they could come around for another attack. Well, the Arrow could use this same thing. Only difference is it has more wing area than the F-4 Phantom, so I think it would have actually fared, had you fixed the visibility problems, it would probably fare quite well against the MiG-21 of the day, because that would have been the fighter it would have most likely encountered, would be a MiG-21, MiG-15. Again, 1959, the Soviets were still using those airplanes, quite rapidly. And of course, the MiG-23 would be probably, again, something that the Arrow would encounter. So with that said, having an airplane that could, zoom up to 70,000 feet is a huge advantage over the Soviets' fighter technology of the day. And again, it could allow you to get up high and then regroup again and come around, do high-speed slashing attacks on your opponent. And again, if you were, like the F-4 Phantom, the Arrow didn't have a gun at that point, but if you were to put a 25 or even a 20 millimeter at the time, would have probably been sufficient, and a couple of thousand rounds, you could have blasted down bombers all day. and you could probably even go toe to toe with the dog in the dogfight. Again, having the huge advantage of wing area, the huge advantage of climb rate, and the huge advantage of you know, uh, very powerful engines, huge advantage of high speed cruise and long range. What's not to like? Again, never got to see the full potential, but even the original variation of the aircraft was still capable of Mach 2.5 aerodynamically. Again, it would probably, to be able to super cruise, it would definitely have to be built out of more modern materials. But again, in this modern day and age, you could probably build the same airplane at a third of the 2/3 of the weight, maybe 30,000 pounds with this, 30,000 pounds of thrust in each engine or more. Who knows what kind of, maybe you'd have two 40,000 pound thrust class engines in there. I mean, you had 52-inch blowholes or 50-inch blowholes, uh, you know, in those in the exhaust, jet exhaust. I mean, that's big. You could, in 1959, you could get 31,000 pounds of thrust through that. What can you get through it today? So again, make the airplane say 30 to 36,000 pounds with that much power behind it. Hang on for dear life and good visibility. Yeah, you got yourself potential. And even at that, you would probably could increase the maneuverability because if you can make the airplane lighter, you can pull higher Gs. So the potential of the Arrow is still, and of course, if you make it lighter, you could also burn less fuel, at a higher cruise speed. Again, you get super cruise and long range at the same time. Maybe it'd have a 3,000-mile range. The Arrow carried about 2,900 gallons internally. That's a lot. Now, if you compare it to the modern day Su-27, which has pretty darn good engines, yes, the Su-35, the Su-27 had a 2,700-mile range with about 2,000 gallons of fuel. But again, it has the wing area to be able to pull it off. It's a slight lift body kind of concept, although not a stable airframe, and it was, has to solely fly on fly-by-wire and hydraulics. It still has it's still a very efficient airplane for what it is, which makes it good for long-range patrols. That's why the Su-27 is probably better suited for Canada. Anything Russians have is pretty much perfectly suited for Canada because of our climates are so similar. Whereas the American airplanes, most of the American airplanes, except for the stuff up in Alaska, really spend a lot of time in the sunshine. So, here in Canada, one of the biggest problems we have with the CF or the F-35 program is that it's a single-engine airplane, and if we're going to be up in the Arctic with these things, we get a flame out up there, which most modern jets don't flame out that much, but in the Arctic, anything can happen. Things break in the cold. And if you have a pilot that has to bail out over the Arctic, make sure you give him enough, that one 9mm round to do himself in when he's surrounded by polar bears. You know what I'm saying? If he survives. I mean, yeah, you might survive the bailout, but you'll freeze to death before they can find you. So you really need a twin-engine aircraft. Now, the contenders right now, although they're not going to do it because, again, yeah, the F-35 program, again, if the airplane could live up to its hype, it would be an excellent airplane. It's a good airplane when it works. The design is pretty cool, but it's still a single-engine airplane, and because of that, you need that double-engine reliability for Canada because it's a big, it's a big country, and also too, again, what couldn't you fit in an airplane the size of the Avro Arrow? You got 85 feet of wish list. Just stick it in there. You need. Any sort of, I mean, the thing would become an Earth orbit satellite. I mean, you could have any sort of avionic in there, electronics, anything you can think of. And you can still do it on a simple, low-maintenance airframe that, even back in the day, the Arrow, it was a high-maintenance air. All those airplanes were, because you have to understand, before every flight, you have to make sure the hydraulics work, all that. But the Arrow in itself was a fly-by-wire airplane. A lot of people might not know that. It was basically flew on electric servos and hydraulics. So technically it was a fly-by-wire airplane, which it's not the same as the fly-by-wire airplanes now, which require computers. This was just basically, think of it like a gigantic radio control airplane. There was only one recorded incident where the Arrow did a strange kind of pitch-up while it was flying in a straight line. One of the arrows pitched up just out of nowhere without any input on the controls. That was the only incident, so it could have been some sort of short or whatever moisture on the servo or whatever. But that was the only recorded of the of that happening. The problem, one of the problems they were worried about with the Arrow was that the pilots couldn't because they were basically flying a gigantic remote control airplane, is the simplest way you could put it, that they couldn't feel the control input on, the pressure on the wings, that seat of the pants flying that they were used to, that they were worried that if they pulled too hard back on the stick, they wouldn't realize that they would actually rip a wing off. And again, when we're talking those kind of pressures on an airplane that big in those times, yeah, you could pull a wing off. It's been done. It's been done. Structure failure on fighter jets is not an uncommon thing, even in today's modern jets. So it doesn't happen super often, but if you're not careful, yeah, it will happen. So that was one of the things that they had to come up with, basically a dampening system. So whenever you would pull back on the stick, you could feel the pressure on the wings and stuff like the loading in the wings. So that was kind of a neat, again, little Canadian innovation. But again, this was a Buck Rogers airplane for its time. Now, if I were to design the Arrow, would I have done it that way? No, I would have made sure everything was analog as possible. Again, to keep things. I mean, an airplane like this is going to have to fly with hydraulics, no doubt about it. But the thing is, I would make it as direct. Maybe not necessarily bell crank, but shafts, whatever you could use to make sure that you could feel everything. And then have obviously you could have a autopilot and all that stuff. The Arrow actually did fly. You could fly it from the rear cockpit. Again, using like a radio control kind of method where you could, basically punch in the coordinates to where you wanted to go, punch in the speed you wanted to go at, and hit the button, and basically the pilot in the front seat could have lunch, while the basically radio operator and slash navigator in the back could do whatever they wanted, and they could basically pilot the airplane basically on instruments. Now in the rear cockpit, when you're sitting in there, it was very dark, and there was like a tiny little maybe 6-inch window that you let in a little bit of light, but because of the instruments and stuff like that was back there, it needed to be dark in there, and it was. But when you're in there, if you wouldn't want to be in the back seat of the Arrow if you were a claustrophobic person. But the cockpit itself was actually quite roomy. It is a pretty big airplane. You could stretch your legs in it. So I wouldn't call it an airliner by any chance, but you did have a lot of leg room in there. It's just the visibility wasn't the best. But again, the early stages of it never got a chance to fully develop it. So I think the Arrow still has potential. Would I build it identically to what it was? No. I would modernize the version. Again, a full bubble glass canopy on it. I would keep it a Delta. I wouldn't bother with canards yet. I would just basically get a basic flying airplane, keep it as simple and as low maintenance as possible, make it out of the best materials possible, to make it as light and as strong as possible, and obviously the most powerful engines you could get, with the best fuel efficiency to give you range. Because I think range is, even if the airplane only did Mach 2, even in today's standard, it would still be more of a benefit to be able to super cruise and have a lower top, full afterburn, speed than it, and have tremendous range, like 3 or 4,000 mile range on it. That would be a better benefit than being able to do, say, Mach 3. But there was a Mach 3 variant considered in design. Again, program was canceled before it ever got a chance to do that. But you can make the Mach 3 variant now. Again, all the science behind this has already been done. It's already been done. Basically, it's tool up and make the airplane, and do light changes in areas where could be improved. I mean, you could have every kind of system you could possibly imagine on it, and you wouldn't have to invent a thing. I mean, everything that's on the CF-18 that works well, you put it on this, avionics wise, like the radar, that type of thing. And then later on, if you want to boost up the radar, one thing about a nose cone that big is you can put big things in there. You could put a much more powerful radar, better radar jamming equipment. You could have obviously all kinds of, sky's the limit. Sky's the limit. So that's my take on it. Keep it a simple airframe. Actually try to simplify and lower the maintenance from the original. Make it as simple as possible, as strong as possible, as light as possible, and as powerful as possible, and as long range as possible. Then you got yourselves an all-weather, long-range patrol, fighter interceptor, reconnaissance, trainer, slash aerobatic, slash, whatever you want it to be. And you could do it all with one aircraft. And why? Because the aircraft's big enough to do it. And again, super maneuverability, 60 degrees of pitch and yaw, like most the Sukhoi airplanes have. You could achieve it with that much wing area. Again, you'd have to, look at the design again to make sure that the wing loading would stay. But to say that it couldn't be done is of course it could be done. Again, a very simplistic design. Keeping it simple is what makes this airplane work and what can make it work in the future. Will they ever build one? Absolutely not. Why? Political. We don't have patriotism in the Canadian government for the most part. We have globalists in there, so obviously globalists are going to go with the big make work project of the F-35. The F-35, if we're going to buy a single engine fighter, just going with current fighters, I say the Saab Gripen is a better deal. Why? For the 65 F-35s that we were going to get, we could probably have 500 Saab Gripens, and I'd rather have 500 of those than, which are a great little airplane too. You could have maybe 50 of them, tandem seat and the rest all single seat. There you go, nice and cheap to run, lower maintenance, already proven. That type of thing. It has the look down, shoot down system, very advanced. Saab Gripen, I think, is a great little airplane. Is it as good as an Su-35? Probably not. I'd put my money on the Su-35, but Su-35 is much more expensive to run. That if you were going to run something that big, you might as well build your own. Just saying. Now the other contender is the Rafale. The Rafale is an excellent. There you go. You got your double engine, very advanced airplane, voice activated stuff in the cockpit. But again, Eurofighter, Rafale, these two airplanes, although very capable, again, once you get into those costs, is it really the best way to go? The airplane that would make the most sense in this current day for Canada would be the Super Hornet, just because it's very similar to what we already have, and there's probably a lot of things that will just basically interchange from the Super Hornet to from the CF-18 to the Super Hornet, such as like landing gear parts and stuff like that. Probably uses the same landing gear and stuff like that. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but you get the idea. The Super Hornet is basically a steroided version of the CF-18 or the FA-18, that type of thing. So it would give you a lot of the new stuff if we were going to go with new designs. The only reason why if there was politics had nothing to do with it, and I was going to pick an Air Force for Canada, the airplanes I would pick, if cost were of no consequence, of modern day would be the Su-35, the Russian Su-35, as the main fighter, because there's two variants. There's a canard variant and one without canards. I'd get a couple of each, maybe about, say, 20 of each. And then as a kind of two-seat version, I would get the Su-34. Again, the commonality of landing gear and stuff like that and other parts, engine parts, stuff like that, you get that advantage. And then, of course, as an attack aircraft, A-10. The A-10, I think, is the attack aircraft. And I'd probably get 2,000 A-10s. Why? Because I think the A-10, modernize the A-10, you've got yourself an Air Force to be reckoned with. Put slightly more powerful engines in it, so that work on fuel consumption so that the thing has, pilots are, flying an 8-hour day without refueling, that type of thing. So the A-10, I think, is highly overlooked, because of its simplicity, low maintenance, the fact that it can take off and land just about anywhere. Another variation would be a Frogfoot, or the Su-39, Su-25 and the Su-39 Frogfoots. They would have a lot of potential, but I would take an A-10 over a Frogfoot. Just, I don't know. Different flying tank. Both have their advantages, but that's the Air Force I would pick at a current. Airplane that I would pick, perfect for Canada. If again no limitations, would be a modern version of the Avro Arrow with a 25mm main gun right in front of the nose, analog. Use it as a tank buster. Put some spoilers on the Arrow so that you could slow it down in a dive. Keep the same amount of wing area. Again, make the airplane lighter, make it a little bit more tougher like an A-10 so that it could do attacking rolls, but make sure it was light enough that it could intercept at 11, 12 miles a minute and make it to 80,000 feet operational service, and maybe a max altitude of 120 or whatever. Like to make 31. Make sure it could super cruise at over Mach 1, obviously. Top speed, anywhere above Mach 2 would be fine. Range would be more of an emphasis on range and climb rate, so above 2,000 mile range would be the requirement. Obviously, internal bomb bay, of course, have extra provisions for hard points and fuel tanks and what have you. Bubble canopy. Yeah, there we go. And keep it as simple and as low maintenance as possible. Build it all in Canada. Build it by Canadians. Design it for Canada, and then nobody comes to Canada unless invited. Why? Because the Arrow would be prowling at 70,000 feet. Again, it could be done. Why not? So anyway, I guess I'll leave it at that. So if you like this kind of content, maybe please consider making a donation to help out the channel. Crowdfunded is always, the more you help me, the more I can make these type of things if you liked it. Thank you very much to everybody who's made donations. Take advantage of the comments. I mean, what do you think about this whole idea of a new Arrow for Canada? I think it's because it is a plane that was designed for Canada. That's why I think it would work so much as a replacement plane for Canada. Just modernize it, that's all, without getting ridiculous. The guy who basically designed the F-16 and the A-10 had the right idea. Keep it simple. Fighters don't need to be astronomically expensive. Problem is you have too big to fail mentality, and that's why things fail. But keep it simple, and you have a winner, and just refine it. So anyway, I guess leave it at that. So yeah, make your comments. What do you think about it? Rate, share, like, all that good stuff. Give it a thumbs up, and be true to yourself. Be true to others. And always, always do the right thing. Have yourselves a great day, eh? G'day, hi, and welcome. Alright, let's get this show on the road. Okay, number one, you've got one advantage. I'm an attention whore, so I make a lot of videos. Number two, I love the Avro Arrow, so why not make a video of the Avro Arrow? Why not? And plus somebody asked me, dude, can you make a video of the Avro Arrow? Although I've done a couple of them, you never have to twist my rubber arm to talk about this airplane. I'm one of those very few people that ever had the opportunity to actually sit in the Avro Arrow cockpit. Arrow 206 that was sitting at the National Aviation Museum. The nose of the airplane's there, the part of the wing, landing gear. There was also some models, and of course there was one of the nice, big, huge Iroquois engines sitting there. And or was it a Renda engine? I can't remember which. Anyway, one of the coolest things about this airplane when you get into it, okay, is it really did feel like a Buck Rogers airplane. When you close the clamshell type of cockpit doors, you really couldn't see very well forward. I can tell you that from first-hand experience. But it was kind of neat. It would have done its role as an interceptor. Now, from the videos that I have made on the Arrow in the past, comments go all over the board. It's the best plane that was ever designed in history. The thing was a piece of junk and it was over budget. There was a lot, everybody has something to say about the Arrow. I try to look at it as realistically as possible, and I think I do a pretty decent job of knowing what I'm looking at. There's a lot of things that the Arrow isn't, and there's a lot of things that it was that, we lost. With the bigger side of what we lost was the number one, innovative people that worked on it. Number two was that kind of future of independence towards, our own kind of Air Force designed airplanes. I mean, the Russians designed their own airplanes. The Americans designed their own airplanes. The French and the British designed their own airplanes. People, have all these airplanes that the Chinese design their own airplanes, all kinds of stuff like that. With the innovation of Canadians, particularly in the 1950s, there was no reason why we shouldn't have. Now, yes, Avro Canada was a British-owned company, but what people don't understand is that the Avro Arrow was a complete Canadian undertaking. There was no British involvement. It was basically the British said, okay, well, we'll let them build their airplane in their own country. Why not? Even though technically the company was a British company, but it wasn't a British airplane. It was a Canadian airplane. And the uniqueness of it, it's probably one of very few airplanes that went instantly into production. There was no prototype with the Arrow. The Arrow was basically designed to replace the CF-100, but to cut costs, what they did, they said, we'll design it so perfectly that we won't have to have a prototype. It'll just go right into service, which was in itself a hugely risky move. I don't know of any other company in history that has ever done that, but we did. Now, the first maiden flight had pretty much zero malfunctions. The only thing, I think there was one little pot lamp that didn't light up, or a switch that didn't light up. That was the only recorded malfunction on that flight. I think total hours flown was something like 68 or 168 hours. It's been a while since I looked at all that stuff, so if I'm wrong, please forgive me. I know there's some purists out there that will, you bastard, how did you get that wrong? This is the nose that I sat in. Both forward and aft cockpit are still part of that airplane. This is a life-size replica that they made. Oh, whoops, that's from the Ottawa Aviation Museum. Some of those old, the Lank and stuff like that. I spent a lot of my lunch hours in those. Sorry, those pictures ended up getting into the Avro thing. But hey, you know what? A MiG-15, that's possible that, the Arrow could have been intercepting MiG-15s, but it was primarily designed for a couple of roles. Number one, it was a patrol airplane, interceptor. The idea was NORAD would detect in any weather whatsoever, if they detected Tu-95, the Tupolev Bears, or the Badger, I forget what is it the 144 Badger? Anyway, and the Bison, these Soviet bombers, which the Bison didn't live up to its potential, but it was jet powered and a little faster than the Bear, and this put it just slightly out of the range envelope of the CF-100, and the CF-100 could make it to the altitude. Like, the CF-100 was a good airplane. It served till 1986 with the Canadian RCAF, but the thing is that it wasn't quite fast enough to catch the newer Soviet bombers at altitude. It could make it to the altitude, but the fighter was as fast as their bomber, so it means you couldn't gain on them. So we needed a new interceptor. Hence the idea for the Arrow came along, and there were several different variants that they thought about, basically making a delta wing version of the Starfighter, the CF-104 Starfighter, but it was too small. It lacked in range. It would have been a hell of a dogfighter, I'm sure, but we needed something with more range, something bigger, and something that could get there fast. Well, that was the Arrow. So when they finally decided on it would be a delta winged airplane, they had to decide how much wing area it would have. Would it have 1,000 square feet, 1,200 square feet, or 1,400 square feet? Now, the 1,400 square foot, that thing would have been, the Arrow was big enough as it is. It was 85 feet long. So with a 1,400 square feet, that was a lot of wing area. But they figured the drag factor, they would have lost a bit in speed. So they settled in the compromise to give up a little bit of maneuverability with the 1,000 square foot wingspan or wing area. They went with the 1,200, which is the best of both worlds. Gave them a good, stable platform, great interceptor, good at high altitude. The thing rolled at about 150 degrees a second, so that was pretty much World War II type Spitfire kind of maneuverability, 15 degrees of pitch and yaw, from what I understand. The thing would have probably maneuvered very similarly to the F-4 Phantom. I believe it would have done pretty good that way. Where I think it would have done better than the F-4 Phantom is at high altitudes. Number one, the Arrow had a lot more wing area. The idea of the 1,200 square foot wing area, the only combat aircraft that I know of, or frontline fighter interceptor now that has that much wing area currently, would be the Su-27 and Su-35 line. The big airplanes. CF-100 or CF-18, I think, has something like 660 square feet of wing. Don't quote me on the number, but it's in that ballpark. Most of the American airplanes have less wing area, but they tend to have higher roll rates, where a lot of the Soviet aircraft tend to have lower roll rates, but more wing area, which gives them better range, such as the Su-27 and stuff like that. Now, the MiG-29 is a small airplane. It has, it's very comparable to the CF-18 or the FA-18 in wing area, but the MiG-29